I am Morgan, 29 years old and still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a forensic accountant, I escaped their toxicity, but maintained contact to keep the peace. Right after Grandpa Elias had his funeral while the elite of Baldwin Hills were still walking out our door, my mother pulled me into the study. Between fake tears and her designer morning dress, she leaned forward and smirked. "You know, Morgan, you are lucky we even let you stay in this house. But now it is time for you to leave." I looked at her, sipped my water, and smiled. That night, I logged into a private server, disabled their access to the family accounts, and checked the cameras at the Malibu beach house they knew nothing about. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Baldwin Hills in Los Angeles meant privilege to any outsider looking in. But inside our sprawling, custom-built mansion, emotional coldness permeated every single corner. Our massive home was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood bedroom became my sanctuary and my prison. From elementary school through college, I maintained straight grades and joined honor societies, but it was never enough. My older sister, Sydney, was the golden child. As a former university beauty queen, she was paraded around our social circles as the ultimate prize and face of our family legacy. I was just the quiet disappointment who liked math. The only person who saw my true potential was Grandpa Elias. He was a self-made billionaire in the logistics industry. He built his empire from the ground up and knew how greedy his daughter Vivian had become. The scent of white lilies still hung heavy in the study. The catering staff was cleaning up the last champagne glasses from the funeral reception. I stood near the mahogany bookshelf when Vivian locked the doors behind us. Sydney stood next to her, adjusting a diamond tennis bracelet she had bought with Grandpa's credit card the day he passed away. Standing right behind Sydney was her husband, Connor. Connor was a white tech bro from Silicon Valley who played the white savior for our prominent black family. He acted like his presence elevated our status, even though his venture capital firm had never produced a successful product. "Listen to me carefully," Connor said, adjusting his tailored suit jacket. He looked down at me with a sickeningly sweet smile. "Sydney and I are moving into the main house permanently to manage the estate properly. My venture capital firm is expanding rapidly, and I need a dedicated workspace. Your old bedroom on the first floor is the only space with the correct lighting and square footage for my monitors. It is time for you to pack up and find an apartment. Maybe you can find something closer to your accounting job downtown." Sydney chimed in immediately, checking her reflection in the glass cabinet. "Connor is absolutely right, Morgan. You are almost 30 years old and still painfully single. It is embarrassing for the family image. You do not need to take up valuable space in this massive home when you are not building a family of your own. You are holding us back from maximizing this property." My mother Vivian crossed her arms and nodded in fierce agreement. "Sydney and Connor represent the bright future of this family name. You have always been selfish, Morgan. You always take and take. Just like when you refused to hand over your scholarship money to your sister when she needed to go on her European tour. I want your bags packed within the hour. You are leaving this house tonight, and I do not want to hear a single word of complaining." They all stared at me, waiting for the familiar tears. They expected me to beg for their love, to plead for a place in the home where I grew up, to apologize for simply existing. That is what the old Morgan would have done. But the old Morgan died the same day Grandpa Elias did. I did not shed a tear. I did not raise my voice. I simply nodded once, turned around, and walked straight out of the study. I went into my bedroom and pulled out a single black suitcase. I did not pack the expensive dresses Vivian had bought me for family photo operations. I did not take the jewelry or the shoes. I only packed my laptop, my forensic accounting files, and a small wooden box Grandpa Elias had secretly given me a month before his heart failed. It contained the encryption keys to a blind trust no one else in the world knew about. I zipped up the suitcase, walked out the front door, and did not look back. I ordered an Uber and watched the iron gates of the Baldwin Hills mansion close behind me. As the car rolled down the winding hills toward the city lights, the air felt crisp and freeing. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window, finally breathing a sigh of relief. But the quiet moment did not last long. My phone screen suddenly lit up the dark back seat. It was an urgent security alert from my private server. Someone was actively trying to breach the firewall on Grandpa Elias's hidden financial files. I opened the log and saw the digital footprint instantly. It was Connor. He had just initiated a wire transfer attempt and filed forged paperwork to take out a $2 million loan against an asset he did not even own. I smiled to myself as the car merged onto the highway, heading toward the coast. Connor thought he had just kicked me out of my own home, but he had no idea he had just walked right into a federal trap. The tires of the Uber hummed against the asphalt as we merged onto the Pacific Coast Highway. The dark ocean stretched out to my left, illuminated only by the scattered moonlight reflecting off the crashing waves. I rolled down the window just an inch, letting the cold, salty air clear the lingering scent of funeral lilies from my senses. My phone was still glowing with the security alert from my private server. I did not panic. Instead, I opened my contacts and dialed Julian, my senior partner at the forensic accounting firm. He picked up on the second ring, his voice sharp and wide awake, despite the late hour. I told him Connor had just taken the bait. Julian let out a low chuckle through the speaker. He asked if Connor was actually arrogant enough to try and bypass the firewall we set up last month. I confirmed he was. Julian and I had spent the last 2 years helping Grandpa Elias restructure his entire financial empire into a fortified blind trust. Grandpa was a brilliant man. The moment Sydney brought Connor home to Baldwin Hills, claiming he was some hotshot venture capitalist from Silicon Valley, Grandpa saw right through the cheap suit and the buzzwords. He knew Connor was a parasite looking for a wealthy black family to latch onto. So Grandpa quietly transferred his liquid assets and his most prized real estate into a trust that left no paper trail for a vulture like Connor to follow. Julian typed rapidly on his keyboard on the other end of the line. He told me he was seeing the same ping on his end. He said Connor was submitting loan applications to a private offshore lender. I asked how much he was asking for. Julian paused and said $2 million. My grip on the phone tightened. I asked Julian what Connor was using as collateral, because we both knew Connor did not have 2 million cents to his name. Julian said Connor was uploading property deeds, but the files were encrypted so he could not see exactly which property yet. I told Julian I was almost at the primary server location and would decrypt the files myself. We hung up and I leaned back against the leather seat. The Uber driver pulled over on a desolate stretch of the highway in Malibu. There were no streetlights here, just the rugged cliffside dropping off into the Pacific Ocean. I thanked the driver, tipped him well, and waited until his taillights disappeared around the bend before I moved. I walked toward what looked like a solid wall of natural rock covered in creeping ivy. I reached behind a specific patch of greenery and placed my thumb against a hidden biometric scanner. A soft green light scanned my print, and a heavy disguised steel door clicked open with a quiet hiss. I stepped inside and walked down a softly lit floating staircase that descended directly into the cliff. At the bottom was Grandpa Elias' true legacy. It was a breathtaking multi-level house made almost entirely of reinforced glass and steel, built right into the side of the mountain overlooking the private beach below. He had spent 10 years building this escape far away from the suffocating social climbing of my mother and the endless drama of my sister. This was our sanctuary. It was where he taught me how to read balance sheets and where we spent hours watching the tide come in. And now it was my command center. I walked past the minimalist leather furniture and went straight to the sleek wooden desk facing the ocean window. I opened my black suitcase, pulled out my laptop, and connected a hardwire cable directly into the hidden port under the desk. The master server hummed to life. Multiple screens flickered on, illuminating the dark room with lines of complex financial data. I cracked my knuckles and went to work. Being a forensic accountant meant I knew exactly how to follow the money, even when people tried to bury it under layers of shell companies. It only took me 7 minutes to bypass the encryption on the files Connor had uploaded to the offshore lender. When the documents finally opened on my screen, a cold smile spread across my face. Connor had actually done it. He had submitted a massive loan application for $2 million, and to secure the money he had uploaded the deed to the Baldwin Hills mansion. But there was a massive problem for him. The deed he uploaded was a complete forgery. I pulled up the signature page and zoomed in. He had forged my mother's signature perfectly. He was using Vivian Home, the very house they just kicked me out of, as collateral to fund his failing startup. He was so desperate to maintain his wealthy tech bro facade that he was willing to make my family homeless to get a quick cash injection. And my mother and sister were too blinded by his white privilege and smooth talking to ever double-check the family accounts. I hit a few keys and downloaded every single page of his forged loan application. I copied the IP address, the timestamp, and the offshore routing numbers. This was not just a family dispute anymore. This was federal wire fraud. I secured the files into a heavily encrypted folder and sent a backup copy to Julian with strict instructions to hold on to it. I leaned back in the ergonomic chair and looked out at the black ocean. The waves crashed violently against the rocks below. The trap was fully set. Connor thought he had won by kicking me out of the house, but all he had done was hand me the exact weapon I needed to destroy him. I closed my laptop, feeling a deep sense of peace for the first time since the funeral. I was about to go make myself a cup of tea in the kitchen when a sharp electronic chime echoed through the silent house. I stopped dead in my tracks. The sound came from the security console mounted on the wall. The perimeter alarm had just been triggered. I walked over and tapped the screen to bring up the live camera feeds from the highway above. My heart beat a little faster as the high-definition night vision camera focused on the front gate. A sleek white Porsche had just pulled off the highway and parked illegally near the hidden entrance. The driver's side door popped open. I watched the screen closely as a man stepped out into the moonlight, straightening his designer jacket and looking around with a smug expression. It was Connor. He had found me. I watched the screen as Connor slammed the door of his Porsche. He was not alone. A second man stepped out of the passenger side wearing a cheap shiny suit and holding a leather briefcase. He looked exactly like the kind of shady strip mall lawyer Connor would hire to do his dirty work. They walked up to the heavy steel gate that blocked the driveway. Connor began violently shaking the iron bars and yelling my name into the night air. He knew I was in there. I took a deep breath and smoothed down my shirt. I could not let him know about the underground server room or the biometric locks. I had to play the part of the helpless younger sister he expected me to be. I walked away from the monitors and climbed the floating staircase back up to the surface. The cool ocean breeze hit my face as I stepped out onto the gravel driveway and walked toward the iron gates. When Connor saw me approach through the bars, a sickeningly triumphant smile spread across his face. "Well, well, well," he sneered, leaning against the cold metal. "Look who decided to hide out in a multi-million-dollar beach house. You really thought you could pull a fast one on the family, did you not, Morgan?" I stood a few feet back from the gate, keeping my face perfectly blank. I asked him what he wanted and how he even found this place. Connor laughed loudly and patted the shoulder of the lawyer standing next to him. He told me he had his ways, and that when you are a prominent venture capitalist, you have access to private investigators who can track down anything. He explained that his investigator had found tax records linking Grandpa Elias to an anonymous holding company registered to this exact stretch of Malibu coastline. Connor gripped the bars of the gate and lowered his voice, trying to sound intimidating. He told me this was his family now, and he was the one in charge of protecting our legacy. He said he knew Grandpa Elias had built this place in secret, and that I was trying to steal it out from under my mother and sister. The sheer audacity of this white man standing on my property, telling me he was the savior of my black family, made my blood boil. "Listen to me very carefully, Morgan," he said, pointing a finger at me through the iron gate. "I am holding a drafted eviction notice right here in my lawyer's briefcase. You do not own this property. You are just a bitter little accountant who sneaked in here to squat in a dead man's house. I am giving you exactly one chance to hand over the keys and walk away quietly. I crossed my arms and asked him what would happen if I refused. Connor let out a cold, hard laugh. He leaned closer to the gate until his face was practically pressed against the metal. He said, if I did not hand over the keys right now, he would call the local sheriff. He told me to imagine how it would look when the police arrive in this wealthy white neighborhood and find a young black woman trespassing in a hidden estate she cannot afford. He said they would arrest me on the spot and make sure it made the evening news, destroying my precious accounting career forever. He was weaponizing my race and the reality of the world we live in just to intimidate me. He thought his whiteness and his fake wealth made him invincible. He thought I would crumble under the threat of police intervention. So I gave him exactly what he wanted to see. I let my shoulders drop and forced my hands to tremble slightly. I looked down at the gravel and let out a shaky breath, acting as if he had completely broken my spirit. You win, Connor, I said, keeping my voice barely above a whisper. I just wanted a piece of Grandpa to hold on to, but you are right. I do not belong here and I cannot afford a legal battle. Connor puffed out his chest, standing taller. I knew you would see reason, he said smoothly. Now be a good girl and pass the keys through the gate. We have to secure the property for your mother and sister. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a heavy set of brass keys attached to a simple leather strap. These were not the keys to the glass house or the underground server room. Those operated on encrypted biometrics. These were the keys to the old gardening shed at the far end of the property, where the landscaping crew kept the fertilizer and rusty shovels. I walked slowly to the gate and slipped the keys through the iron bars. Connor snatched them from my hand like a greedy child. He held them up in the moonlight, admiring them as if he had just conquered a kingdom. He turned to his lawyer and told him the job was done, and that they could start drawing up the paperwork to list the house for sale by the end of the month. Before he walked back to his car, Connor turned to me one last time. He told me to pack my bags and be gone by sunrise. He said if he saw me anywhere near Malibu or Baldwin Hills again, he would not be so generous. He got into his pristine white Porsche, the engine roaring to life, and sped off down the highway, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. I stood at the gate and watched his taillights fade into the darkness. I was not scared. I was not packing my bags. A genuine smile finally broke across my face. Connor had left gloating, feeling like the ultimate mastermind. But he was completely unaware of the tiny detail I had left out. The heavy brass key he had just shoved into his expensive designer pocket contained a micro RFID tracking chip hidden deep inside the leather strap. He thought he was taking the key to my house, but all he really did was give me a live feed to his exact geographic location 24 hours a day. The game had just begun, and he had already lost the moment. The taillights disappeared. I turned around and walked back to the hidden cliffside entrance. My heart was beating with a calm, steady rhythm. I placed my thumb on the scanner and descended the floating staircase back into the glowing server room. I sat down at the heavy wooden desk and brought up the tracking software. A small red blinking dot appeared on the massive monitor. The RFID chip inside the brass key was broadcasting Connor's exact location. I watched the dot move rapidly down the Pacific Coast Highway, heading back toward the city. But tracking his car was just the first phase of the Trojan horse I had just handed him. The chip inside that key was not just a GPS locator. It was a military-grade, short-range data cloner that Grandpa Elias had acquired from a private security contractor. Connor always kept his expensive smartphone and his work laptop in his leather briefcase, right next to where he had just pocketed my key. The chip was designed to passively copy the encrypted network keys from his devices and transmit them back to my server, using a secure cellular network. I watched the progress bar on my screen slowly fill up as the cloner did its silent work in the dark interior of his Porsche. 20 minutes later, the download was fully complete. I now had absolute backdoor access to the internal network of his venture capital firm. I cracked my knuckles and opened the main financial ledger for his company. He called it Apex Horizon Ventures. Sydney always bragged at dinner parties about how Connor was funding the next generation of tech startups and revolutionizing the medical device industry. I started pulling the bank statements and running the transaction histories through my forensic analysis software. There were no boring numbers here, just a glaring red trail of absolute unmitigated fraud. I opened the incoming wire transfers first. Connor had raised over $12 million in the last 18 months alone. I expected to see deposits from wealthy Silicon Valley tech bros or corporate investment funds. Instead, my stomach dropped as the names of the individual investors populated on the screen. Mr. Henry Rollins, a retired surgeon who sat on the board of my mother's charity foundation. Mrs. Carmen Robinson, the elderly choir director at the Baldwin Hills Community Church. Dr. Lawrence Terry, my grandpa's oldest friend and a retired dentist who had known me since I was a little girl. Every single name on the investor list was a wealthy black senior citizen from my mother's elite social circle. Connor was not raising capital in Silicon Valley. He was using his marriage to Sydney to systematically infiltrate the old money black community of Los Angeles. He used my mother's flawless reputation and my grandpa's legacy to gain the blind trust of her vulnerable aging friends. He knew they would never question a white financial genius who had married into the most prominent family in the neighborhood. I dug deeper into the outgoing ledgers to see where he was investing their hard-earned retirement funds. I looked for tech startups or commercial real estate development projects. There was absolutely nothing. Not a single legitimate investment had been made in the history of the company. Instead, the money was flowing in a rapid circular pattern. When Dr. Terry deposited $50,000, Connor would immediately wire $10,000 to Mrs. Robinson, claiming it was a dividend return on her earlier investment. He was paying off the old investors with the new investors' money. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme executed with terrifying precision. I leaned closer to the monitor, feeling a deep, sickening rage building in my chest. The remaining funds, the money he did not use to pay fake dividends, was being siphoned completely out of the country. I traced the complex routing numbers to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and anonymous shell companies registered in Panama. That was exactly how Sydney was affording her new designer wardrobes and the diamond tennis bracelets she flashed around town. That was how Connor leased his Porsche and bought his expensive tailored suits. They were living a life of extreme luxury financed entirely by stealing the life savings of the black elders who trusted our family name. I pulled up the specific file on Mr. Rollins. The retired surgeon had invested his entire pension into Apex Horizon Ventures just 3 weeks ago. Connor had promised him a guaranteed 20% return to help fund his 4 grandchildren through their college tuition. Yesterday, Connor had drained Mr. Rollins' entire account and transferred the balance to the same offshore bank he used to apply for the fraudulent loan against the Baldwin Hills mansion. The sheer depravity of what this white man was doing was staggering to witness. He had walked into a community of successful black professionals who had spent their entire lives overcoming systemic obstacles to build generational wealth for their families. And he was systematically wiping it all out with a charming smile and a fake investment portfolio. He was bleeding them dry, while my mother proudly paraded him around the country club as the ultimate savior of our family. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I began compiling every single fraudulent transaction, every forged signature, and every illegal wire transfer into an airtight digital dossier. As a forensic accountant, I knew exactly what the federal authorities needed to secure a fast conviction. I needed to build a case so strong that no high-priced defense attorney could ever tear it apart. I worked straight through the night downloading bank statements and matching them against the fake portfolio reports Connor had emailed to his victims. By the time the sun began to rise over the Pacific Ocean, my evidence file was over 2,000 pages long. I had every piece of the puzzle mapped out perfectly down to the last stolen cent. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and rubbed my tired eyes. The trap was fully loaded and ready to spring. I just needed the perfect public venue to drop the bomb and expose him for the criminal he was. Right at that moment, my phone vibrated loudly on the wooden desk, breaking the peaceful silence of the underground room. The bright screen cut through the morning shadows. I picked it up and saw a new notification. It was a group text message from my mother, Vivian, sent to me, Sydney and Connor. The message was cold and direct, as always. It said, "Morgan, you are mandated to attend a family dinner tonight at 8 o'clock sharp. We are dining at the Capitol Grill downtown. Dress appropriately and do not embarrass me. We are celebrating Connor and his incredible new real estate acquisition." I stared at the text message, reading the words over and over again. Connor had actually told them he secured the Malibu beach house. He was using the fake deed he forged last night to elevate his status even further in my mother's eyes. He wanted to celebrate stealing from me while he was simultaneously robbing her closest friends blind. A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. I locked the server screen and stood up from the desk. I typed a simple response back to the group chat. "I will be there," I replied. I tossed the phone onto the desk and walked over to the closet. It was time to get dressed for dinner. I pulled a simple black silk dress from the closet. It was understated, elegant, and completely devoid of the flashy designer logos my mother and sister worshipped. I drove back into the city feeling a strange sense of anticipation. The Capitol Grill was packed with the downtown business elite when I arrived at exactly 8 o'clock. The maitre d' led me to a semi-private dining alcove in the back of the restaurant. My family was already there holding court and drinking expensive champagne. Vivian was wearing a sequined blazer that caught the dim restaurant lighting. Sydney was draped in silk and wearing the diamond tennis bracelet she bought with Grandpa's money. And Connor was sitting at the head of the table looking like the arrogant king of a stolen castle. I pulled out my own chair and sat down across from him. Nobody offered me a glass of champagne. Sydney looked me up and down with a sneer wrinkling her perfectly contoured nose. She asked if I had come straight from a funeral or if I just enjoyed looking like a depressed librarian. She told me I should have used some of the money I saved by living rent-free in Grandpa's house to buy a decent outfit. She said it was embarrassing to be seen with a number cruncher who did not even know how to dress for a high-end dinner. I placed my napkin on my lap and looked at her calmly. I told her I preferred clothes I could actually afford to pay for myself. Sydney rolled her eyes and took a sip of her drink, totally missing the underlying threat in my words. My mother, Vivian, slammed her glass down on the table to get our attention. She told us to stop bickering and remember why we were there. She beamed at Connor with a level of pride she had never once shown me. Vivian raised her glass and announced we were celebrating a monumental day for the family legacy. She said Connor had single-handedly secured a multi-million-dollar property in Malibu that Grandpa Elias had selfishly tried to hide from them. She went on and on about Connor's brilliant financial mind and how his venture capital firm was elevating our family status to new heights. I watched Connor soak up the praise. He leaned back in his leather chair and unbuttoned his suit jacket, trying to look humble. He told Vivian it was his honor to step up and be the man of the house now that Grandpa was gone. He said he was just doing what any good husband and son-in-law would do to protect their assets. The sheer hypocrisy made my skin crawl, but I kept my expression perfectly neutral. Connor reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded document. He slid it across the white tablecloth, stopping right in front of my empty dinner plate. He pulled a gold pen from his shirt pocket and laid it on top of the paper. I asked him what this was. Connor gave me a condescending smile. He said it was a standard quitclaim deed. He explained that his lawyers were finalizing the transfer of the Malibu property into his venture capital portfolio so he could develop the land into luxury condos. But because Grandpa Elias had weirdly left a few utility bills in my name, he needed me to legally sign away any potential squatter rights or inheritance claims. Sydney chimed in, saying it was just a formality. She told me to stop being difficult and just sign the paper so we could order the steaks. She said Connor was generously offering to give me $5,000 out of his own pocket as a relocation fee just for signing. Connor tapped the gold pen against the table. He told me 5 grand was more than enough to cover a security deposit on a cheap apartment downtown. He said I should be thanking him for not pressing charges for trespassing last night. He ordered me to sign on the dotted line so we could celebrate his new development project in peace. I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I picked up the quitclaim deed and began to read it. I read every single line of the dense legal jargon with the trained eye of a forensic accountant. My mother sighed loudly, crossing her arms and complaining about how long I always took to process simple instructions. Connor chuckled and told Vivian to give me a minute because legal documents were probably too complicated for a simple bookkeeper to understand. I reached the second page of the document and a genuine bright smile spread across my face. I gently placed the paperwork back on the table and pushed the gold pen away. I looked directly into Connor's smug blue eyes. I told him I would not be signing the document. Connor slammed his hand on the table, his face turning red. He demanded to know what my problem was and threatened to have his lawyers drag me through court for years. I kept my voice low and steady. I told him his lawyers were either completely incompetent or actively trying to get him arrested. I pointed to the property description on the second page. I explained that a quitclaim deed only transfers the ownership interest of the person signing it. But in order to draft this specific document, his lawyers had to list the actual registered owner of the Malibu estate. I tapped my finger on the printed text. I asked Connor if he had actually read the deed before bringing it to dinner. I told him the property was not owned by Grandpa Elias as an individual. It was owned by a corporate entity called the Elias Coastal Trust. And according to California state law, you cannot force an individual to sign a personal quitclaim deed for a property owned by a corporate trust. But that was not even the best part. I leaned across the table and lowered my voice so only the four of us could hear. I told Connor that because he had officially submitted this paperwork to a notary, he had just legally documented his attempt to seize assets from a corporate entity he had no authorization to access. I smiled sweetly and told him his quitclaim deed was not just completely invalid, it was a written confession of attempted corporate fraud. The silence at the table was deafening after I spoke those words. Connor stared at the piece of paper as if it had just caught fire. The smug confidence that had radiated from him all night completely evaporated, leaving behind a pale mask of sheer panic. He looked at me and then looked frantically around the restaurant to see if anyone had overheard my little legal analysis. His hands began to shake slightly as he reached out to snatch the quitclaim deed back from my side of the table. He crumpled the document into a tight ball and shoved it deep into his suit pocket. He slammed his fist on the table, causing the crystal wine glasses to rattle and spill expensive champagne onto the white tablecloth. He told me I was crazy, and that I had no idea what I was talking about. He raised his voice, drawing the attention of the surrounding tables where other wealthy patrons were dining. He said I was just a bitter, jealous little girl making up lies because I could not stand to see my sister married to a successful man. He told me my grandpa was an old fool for leaving a corporate trust to a glorified calculator like me, and that his elite legal team would bury me in so much litigation I would never see the light of day. I just sat there sipping my water, watching him unravel in real time. The more he yelled, the more I saw the frightened little boy hiding behind the expensive tailored suit and the venture capitalist buzzwords. His entire facade was cracking under the pressure of a single undeniable truth. Sydney looked back and forth between us, her face flushed with intense embarrassment. She reached out and put her manicured hand on Connor's arm, telling him to lower his voice and that people were staring at them. But Connor yanked his arm away with such force that it startled her. He told her to shut up and let him handle it. It was the first time I had ever seen him drop his perfect gentleman act in front of her. Sydney recoiled in shock, her eyes wide as she realized the man she married was entirely capable of treating her just as poorly as he treated me. That was when my mother decided to intervene to protect her golden child and her perfect son-in-law. Vivian pushed her chair back and stood up, her sequined blazer catching the ambient light of the restaurant chandeliers. She was a master of manipulation, and she knew exactly how to play the victim to an audience of her peers. She pressed her hand to her chest and let out a dramatic, loud sob. Tears welled up in her eyes right on cue, flowing down her carefully powdered cheeks. Vivian pointed a trembling finger at me. She told me I was a monster. She cried out loud enough for the entire dining room to hear, saying she could not believe she had raised such a hateful and ungrateful child. She said I had spent my entire life trying to sabotage my sister because I was secretly envious of her beauty and her charm. Vivian claimed I was trying to destroy my sister's beautiful marriage out of pure spite because no man would ever want to marry someone as cold and calculating as me. She sobbed about how Grandpa Elias would be rolling in his grave right now if he saw how disrespectful I was being to the only man who was actually trying to save our family legacy and grow our wealth. The other patrons in the restaurant had completely stopped eating. They were openly watching the spectacle unfold, holding their forks in midair. My mother looked around the room, soaking in the pity and sympathy of the strangers, before turning her vicious, glaring gaze back to me. She told me she was done trying to fix me. She said she had given me every opportunity to be a normal part of this family and to support Sydney and Connor. But I had thrown her love back in her face. Vivian stood tall and took a deep, theatrical breath. She declared loudly that as of this exact moment, I was no longer her daughter. She formally disowned me right there in the middle of the Capitol Grill. She told me I was dead to her and that I was never to contact her or Sydney or Connor ever again. She ordered me to get out of her sight before she called the police to have me escorted off the premises like a common trespasser. It was the moment she had been building up to my entire life. She finally had the public excuse she needed to sever ties with the daughter who did not fit into her perfect elite aesthetic. She fully expected me to break down crying. She expected me to beg for forgiveness in front of the entire restaurant just to save face and crawl back into her good graces. But I felt nothing but profound, immense relief. The heavy, invisible chains of family obligation that had dragged me down for 29 long years suddenly snapped. I looked at my mother and saw a complete stranger. I saw a woman so blinded by her own vanity and desperation for status that she was actively defending the man who was currently stealing her entire life savings and destroying the community she claimed to love. I slowly stood up from the table and smoothed out the fabric of my black silk dress. I picked up my purse and looked Vivian directly in the eye with zero emotion. I told her I accepted her terms without hesitation. I said I would honor her request and never contact her again. I added that I sincerely hoped she remembered this exact conversation when the ugly truth about her perfect son-in-law finally came to light. Vivian scoffed loudly and turned her back to me, pulling a crying Sydney into a comforting hug while Connor practically hyperventilated in his chair. I turned to leave, but I paused right behind Connor's seat. I leaned down slowly until my lips were just an inch away from his ear. The smell of his expensive designer cologne mixed with the sour, metallic stench of his nervous sweat. I kept my voice incredibly soft, a cold whisper meant only for him to hear. I told him he should probably cancel his luxury condo development plans for Malibu. I told him the Securities and Exchange Commission had been making some very interesting inquiries this afternoon regarding his latest offshore wire transfers. I mentioned the specific name of the Cayman Islands bank he had routed Mr. Rollins' retirement pension fund through just yesterday morning. I asked him if he thought his shady strip mall lawyer would be able to handle federal prosecutors when they inevitably came knocking on his door for operating a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. I pulled back and looked at his face. All the color drained from his skin, instantly leaving him looking like a sick ghost. His jaw went completely slack, and his eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated terror as he realized the magnitude of what was happening. He realized I knew everything. I had every bank receipt, every forged signature, and every stolen dollar perfectly documented on a secure federal server. He tried to speak to say something to defend himself, but only a pathetic, quiet wheezing sound escaped his dry throat. I gave him one last polite, genuine smile and turned on my heel. I walked out of the restaurant with my head held high, the steady, confident sound of my heels clicking against the hardwood floor echoing in the otherwise silent dining room. I left them sitting there at the table, a fragile family built entirely on lies and stolen money, while I stepped out into the cool evening air, finally completely free, and holding the exact match that would burn their entire fake empire to the ground. The drive back to the Malibu beach house was the most peaceful journey of my entire life. The highway was completely empty, and the dark ocean felt like a cleansing force washing away decades of family toxicity. The sound of the tires humming against the asphalt was the only companion I needed. I knew Connor was not going to just sit at that restaurant table and wait for the federal authorities to arrive and arrest him. A cornered rat is the most dangerous kind of animal, especially when it realizes its entire survival is completely dependent on a lie. By the time I reached the hidden cliffside entrance and placed my thumb on the biometric scanner, my phone was already buzzing frantically in my purse. The moment I descended the floating staircase and sat down at my massive server desk, the entire system flared with bright red alert notifications. Connor was launching a desperate, frantic counterattack. He knew I had the digital evidence to destroy his life, so his only play was to try and cripple me before I could take that evidence to the proper authorities. He had forced his shady strip mall lawyer to file a fraudulent emergency injunction in a local county court. The electronic filing was full of absolute lies claiming I was mentally unstable, violently erratic, and an immediate threat to the financial stability of my grandfather's estate. He actually used a forged digital signature from a retired judge to send a total freeze order directly to my primary banking institutions. His goal was simple and completely ruthless. He wanted to freeze every single dollar attached to my name so I could not hire legal counsel or access the basic funds necessary to defend myself in a court of law. He honestly thought if he starved me out financially, I would be forced to crawl back to him and hand over the Malibu property in exchange for access to my own checking account. It was a classic financial abuser tactic designed to break a victim's will to fight back against their oppressor. But Connor completely forgot who he was dealing with in his blind panic. I am a senior forensic accountant who manages billion-dollar blind trusts for a living. My financial infrastructure is built to withstand sophisticated cyber attacks from actual corporate espionage syndicates, not a pathetic tech bro panicking in a steakhouse bathroom. I did not even flinch at his pathetic attempt to ruin me. I simply opened a secure encrypted communication channel to my personal wealth manager at the federal bank. I routed a priority message attaching the raw metadata from Connor's laptop that proved the court order was digitally altered on his exact IP address, just 20 minutes after I walked out of the Capitol Grill. The bank automated security system immediately flagged his lawyer's request as a severe federal offense and locked down my accounts behind secondary biometric firewalls that Connor could never even hope to bypass. His pathetic attempt to ruin me failed before the county server even registered his ridiculous request. With his little attack easily neutralized, I turned my full attention back to the massive crater he had dug for himself. I needed to make absolutely sure the trap was entirely inescapable before I handed the files over to the Securities and Exchange Commission. I went back into the internal network of his fake venture capital firm to review the specific files he submitted for that $2 million offshore loan. Earlier, I had briefly seen the forged signature of my mother on the Baldwin Hills deed, but now I needed to document the exact mechanism of the fraud for the federal prosecutors. I pulled the digital notary stamp attached to the loan file and traced its origin. Connor had not just traced my mother's signature onto a blank piece of paper. He had actually bribed a disgraced public notary to illegally backdate the property transfer documents to make it look like Vivian had willingly surrendered her home. He legally transferred the ownership of my mother's beloved Baldwin Hills mansion into a dummy shell company controlled entirely by his Ponzi scheme. The offshore lender had already approved the fraudulent transaction. The $2 million was currently sitting in a holding account in the Cayman Islands, ready to be dispersed to his angry elderly investors to keep them quiet for just another month. But the offshore lender had placed a massive predatory lien on the Baldwin Hills property in exchange for the fast cash. If Connor missed even a single monthly payment, those dangerous offshore thugs would have the legal right to seize the mansion and throw my mother out into the street. He had literally gambled away her entire life out of pure, unadulterated greed. My mother had absolutely no idea she was technically completely destitute. She thought she was the undisputed queen of the local elite, while her paper crown had already been stolen right off her head. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, wondering exactly how long it would take for her grand illusion to violently shatter into a million pieces. Right at that exact moment, my phone vibrated gently on the polished wooden desk. It was a notification from Instagram. My mother, Vivian, had just posted a brand new video to her main feed. I clicked play and watched the screen in absolute sheer disbelief. My mother was standing in the grand marble foyer of the Baldwin Hills mansion, holding a crystal glass of expensive imported champagne. Sydney was standing right beside her, wearing a fresh designer dress, paid for by stolen retirement funds, trying her best to look perfectly wealthy and unbothered by the total humiliation they had just suffered at the restaurant. My mother was smiling widely at the camera, announcing to her thousands of eager followers that they were throwing a massive farewell open house party this upcoming weekend. She boasted loudly that Connor was in the final stages of selling their historic family estate for a record-breaking $8 million. She confidently claimed they were permanently relocating to an exclusive hidden glass beach house in Malibu that Connor had just brilliantly acquired for the family real estate portfolio. She formally invited the entire Black elite of Los Angeles to come to the mansion on Saturday to celebrate their rising dynasty and toast to their massive success. I paused the video and zoomed in closely on the background of the shot. Connor was standing alone in the shadows behind them. His face was pale gray and he looked like he was about to physically collapse. He knew he did not own Malibu, and he knew the mansion was already mortgaged to criminals, but he was too terrified to tell my mother the truth. He was just going along with her public delusion, completely trapped in his own web of lies. The stage for his final public execution was officially set. Watching my mother prance around the marble foyer on that Instagram video confirmed everything I needed to know. Vivian was completely clueless. She had absolutely no idea that her perfect son-in-law had forged her signature and mortgaged her beloved historic mansion to offshore criminals. She honestly believed she was moving to Malibu. Connor had sold her a spectacular fantasy to keep her docile while he quietly drained the life out of our family legacy. It was almost pathetic to watch her brag to her wealthy followers about a beach house she would never step foot in. She panned the camera around, showing off the crystal chandeliers and the grand sweeping staircase of the Baldwin Hills estate, talking about how she was upgrading her lifestyle. Sydney was right there in the background, wearing a fake smile and dripping in jewelry bought with stolen money. They were entirely consumed by their own fabricated reality. But my pity only lasted for a fraction of a second. My mother had made her choice at the restaurant. She had publicly disowned me to protect the illusion Connor provided. Now she was going to have to live with the devastating reality of her own blind vanity. I turned away from the phone and brought the main server screens back to life. The time for passive observation was officially over. As a senior forensic accountant, I had spent years building a formidable network of federal contacts. I did not need to submit an anonymous tip through a public portal and wait for months for a low-level clerk to review it. I had direct lines to the people who could freeze a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme before the perpetrators even had time to pack a single suitcase. I opened a heavily encrypted email client and drafted a priority message to Special Agent Marcus Wright at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, White Collar Crime Division. Marcus and I had worked together on a massive corporate embezzlement case 2 years ago. He knew my reputation perfectly well. He knew that if I was sending him a file, it was already an airtight, guaranteed conviction that would make his career. I began attaching the preliminary forensic dossier on Connor's fake venture capital firm. I included the offshore routing numbers, the forged loan documents, the backdated notary stamps, and the detailed list of elderly black investors he had systematically defrauded. I highlighted the specific transactions where Connor had siphoned money from Dr. Terry and Mr. Rollins. I explained how Connor was using his marriage into a prominent black family to build false trust within our community and steal their generational wealth. I copied a senior investigator at the Securities and Exchange Commission on the exact same email, just to ensure all federal jurisdictions were fully engaged and ready to strike. I requested an immediate asset freeze on all of Connor's domestic and international accounts. I hit send and watched the progress bar complete. The digital guillotine had just been released into the federal system. But digital evidence was not going to be enough for what I had planned next. I needed something physical, something entirely undeniable to present to the very public audience my mother had so graciously invited to her grand open house. I walked over to the heavy-duty laser printer tucked into the corner of the underground server room and loaded it with high-quality, thick legal paper. I began printing out the absolute truth page by page. I printed the actual registered deed for the Malibu estate, proving it belonged solely to my corporate trust, and that Connor had absolutely zero legal claim to it. I printed the forged loan application featuring my mother's clearly traced signature, proving he had stolen her home right out from under her. I printed the bank statement showing the exact flow of stolen retirement funds into Connor's Cayman Islands accounts. The printer hummed steadily in the quiet room, spitting out page after page of undeniable ruin. The smell of fresh ink and warm paper filled the air. I took the thick stacks of evidence and organized them meticulously into sleek black leather binders. I labeled each binder with surgical precision. One for the fraudulent loan, one for the Ponzi scheme victims, and one for the true ownership of the Malibu estate. I was building the ultimate legal trap, and I was going to spring it right in the middle of Vivian's grand farewell party, when all of her high society friends were watching. I wanted Connor to have nowhere to hide and no way to spin his lies. Just as I was snapping the final black leather binder shut, my cell phone screen lit up brightly on the desk. It was an incoming call from an unknown local number. I did not answer it. I just sat there and let it ring until it finally went to voicemail. A few seconds later, the notification chimed indicating a new audio message had been left. I tapped the screen and put the phone on speaker. It was Connor. The background noise sounded like he was in a moving vehicle driving fast. His voice was completely devoid of the arrogant tech bro charm he usually projected to the world. He sounded breathless, manic, and incredibly dangerous. The panic I had seen in his eyes at the restaurant had mutated into desperate aggression. He told me he knew I had blocked his fake court order at the bank. He said I was playing a very stupid game and that he was completely done being nice to me. He told me he had just hired a team of armed private security contractors to guard the Malibu property gates around the clock. His voice dropped into a vicious, threatening growl as he promised that if I ever stepped foot near the beach house again, his guys had strict orders to physically drag me out and throw all of my belongings directly into the Pacific Ocean. He told me I was nothing but a jealous loser trying to ruin his life and that he would destroy me if I tried to show my face at the open house this weekend. He ended the message by telling me to watch my back because he was not going down without a fight. The line went dead. I deleted the voicemail from my phone. I did not feel an ounce of fear. Connor was flailing blindly in the dark, trying to intimidate a woman who already held all the cards. He thought a few rent-a-cops could keep me away from my own property. He had absolutely no idea that the real threat was not me showing up at Malibu. The real threat was me showing up at the Baldwin Hills mansion with a stack of federal evidence right when his entire fraudulent life was on full public display. I smiled to myself, picked up the heavy black leather binders, and placed them carefully into my leather tote bag. The trap was set, The bait was taken, and now all I had to do was attend the party. The weekend arrived quickly, carrying with it the warm golden sunlight that Los Angeles was so famous for. I spent Saturday morning finalizing the last details of my trap, ensuring every digital file was secure and every physical document in my leather binders was organized perfectly. I chose my outfit with extreme care. I did not want to look like the bitter outcast sister returning to beg for scraps. I wanted to look exactly like the high-powered corporate executive I was. I wore a sharply tailored stark white pantsuit with emerald green silk lining. It was elegant, powerful, and completely unbothered. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, tight bun and put on a pair of classic gold hoop earrings. I looked in the mirror one last time, taking a deep, steadying breath. The quiet, submissive Morgan was dead and buried. The woman staring back at me was a financial assassin ready to execute a flawless operation. I drove the winding roads up into the wealthy enclave of Baldwin Hills. As I approached the family estate, the sheer scale of my mother's vanity became immediately apparent. The massive iron gates were swung wide open, and the long, winding driveway was lined with luxury cars. Bentleys, Range Rovers, and imported sports cars were parked bumper to bumper. Vivian had clearly spared absolutely no expense for her grand farewell party. She had hired a professional valet service to manage the vehicles and an entire team of caterers dressed in crisp white uniforms, carrying silver trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres. I handed my keys to a confused-looking young valet and walked up the wide stone steps toward the heavy double doors of the mansion. The moment I stepped into the grand marble foyer, the overwhelming noise of the party hit me. A live jazz quartet was playing softly in the corner of the massive living room. The air smelled heavily of expensive perfume-roasted duck and imported champagne. The house was completely packed with the most influential members of the local elite. I saw local politicians, prominent doctors, and wealthy real estate developers mingling together in their designer weekend wear. This was my mother's entire world. These were the people whose opinions dictated her entire self-worth. I stood quietly near the entrance, just observing the scene. Vivian was holding court near the grand staircase. She was wearing a flowing silk gown that swept across the marble floor as she walked. She had a crystal glass of champagne in one hand, and she was laughing loudly at a joke someone had just told. Right next to her was Connor. He was wearing a light gray tailored suit, looking every bit the successful young Silicon Valley titan he pretended to be. He had his arm draped casually over Sydney's shoulder. Sydney was practically glowing, wearing a massive diamond necklace that caught the light of the crystal chandeliers above. They looked like the perfect, flawless American family, standing there accepting the congratulations and praise of their wealthy peers. I watched as Vivian practically shoved Connor toward a group of older gentlemen, including Dr. Terry and Mr. Rollins. She loudly introduced him as the brilliant financial mastermind who was single-handedly elevating the family empire. She boasted about the fake Malibu estate sale and how Connor was negotiating record-breaking development deals on the coast. The older men nodded approvingly, shaking his hand and completely unaware that the man they were congratulating had just systematically stolen their entire retirement savings. The absolute sickness of the display made my stomach churn. Connor was smiling and nodding, playing the humble genius, while he secretly knew he was entirely bankrupt and facing federal prison. I adjusted the heavy strap of my leather tote bag on my shoulder and began to slowly walk deeper into the party. I did not try to hide or blend in. The stark white of my tailored suit stood out sharply against the sea of dark cocktail dresses and casual resort wear. A few people turned to look at me, their conversations pausing briefly as they recognized the estranged younger sister they had not seen since Grandpa Elias' funeral. I offered polite, tight smiles to the people I recognized, but I did not stop to make small talk. My eyes were locked directly on the center of the room. It did not take long for someone to notice the disruption in the perfect aesthetic Vivian had carefully curated. Sydney was the first to spot me. She was in the middle of showing off her new diamond tennis bracelet to a group of younger socialites when her eyes suddenly darted past them and landed on me. The fake bright smile completely vanished from her face, instantly replaced by a look of sheer panicked fury. She practically dropped her champagne glass on a passing waiter's tray and began to storm across the crowded living room directly toward me. As she aggressively pushed her way through the crowd of wealthy guests, I noticed her frantically waving her hand in a sharp downward motion toward the back doors. She was signaling the private security team Connor had hired. Three large men wearing tight black suits and earpieces immediately detached themselves from the walls and began moving quickly through the party, converging on my exact location. The trap was about to spring, and the entire room was completely unaware of the massive explosion that was coming. The three massive security guards were only a few feet away from me when my mother suddenly realized what was happening. Vivian had been laughing with the local mayor near the staircase, but her sharp eyes caught the aggressive movement of the men in black suits. She knew that having her own daughter physically dragged out of her farewell party by armed guards would be the ultimate social scandal. It would completely ruin the flawless, elegant aesthetic she had spent months meticulously building. She excused herself from the mayor with a fake, practiced smile and moved across the marble floor with terrifying speed. She intercepted the guards just seconds before they could put their heavy hands on my shoulders. Vivian snapped her fingers, pointing sharply at the floor, and the three men immediately backed away, blending back into the shadows of the hallway. She grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging painfully into the fabric of my white silk suit. She did not say a single word to me in front of her wealthy guests. She just pulled me roughly toward the secluded mahogany library near the back of the mansion and slammed the heavy double doors shut behind us. The library was dark and quiet, completely cutting off the sound of the jazz band and the clinking champagne glasses in the main living room. My mother let go of my arm and spun around to face me. The polite, loving mask she wore for the public completely melted off, leaving behind a cold, ruthless desperation. She was breathing heavily, and a thin layer of sweat was ruining her expensive powder makeup. She glared at me as if I was a disgusting disease that had just infected her perfect home. She asked me what I was doing here. She told me she had explicitly disowned me at the restaurant and that I had absolutely no right to show my face at her private celebration. I stood perfectly still, adjusting the heavy leather tote bag on my shoulder. I looked at her calmly and told her I came to save her life. Vivian let out a sharp, cruel laugh that echoed off the tall wooden bookshelves. She told me I was completely delusional. She said I was nothing but a bitter, jealous failure who could not stand to see her older sister living a perfect, wealthy life. She crossed her arms and paced across the expensive Persian rug. She told me Connor was an absolute genius, and that he was currently in the billiard room finalizing an $8 million sale of this very house to his elite Silicon Valley investors. She said they were moving to the Malibu beach house by the end of the month, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop their rising dynasty. I watched her pace back and forth, completely trapped in the beautiful lie Connor had constructed for her. I felt a brief, fleeting moment of sadness for the mother I never really had. But then Vivian stopped pacing and reached into her sparkling designer clutch. She pulled out a crisp piece of paper and a gold pen. She walked over to the heavy wooden desk in the center of the library and quickly scribbled something down. She marched back over to me and shoved the piece of paper aggressively against my chest. I looked down at it. It was a personal check written out to my name from her private account. The amount was for exactly $10,000. Vivian lowered her voice to a harsh, demanding whisper. She told me to take the money and disappear forever. She said $10,000 was more than enough for a pathetic number cruncher like me to start a new life somewhere far away from Los Angeles. She ordered me to walk out the back door, take my cheap car, and never contact this family again. She told me not to ruin my sister's perfect life just because I was incapable of finding a husband of my own. She looked me directly in the eyes and said she was paying me to stop existing in her world. I stared at the check in my hand. $10,000. That was the exact monetary value my mother placed on my complete absence. She was willing to pay 10 grand to protect the fragile ego of a white tech bro who had secretly forged her signature and mortgaged this very house to offshore criminals. She was trying to bribe me to stay quiet while Connor actively destroyed the generational wealth of the black community she claimed to love so much. The sheer, absolute irony of the situation was almost suffocating. Connor did not have $8 million. Connor did not have wealthy investors waiting in the billiard room. Connor was completely bankrupt, terrified, and actively waiting for the Federal Bureau of Investigation to kick the front doors down. He had lied to her about every single thing in his life, and she was using her last remaining pennies to protect him from me. I did not yell at my mother. I did not cry or beg for her to love me the way I used to when I was a lonely little girl. I simply looked down at the piece of paper in my hands. I grasped the edges of the check and slowly, deliberately ripped it straight down the middle. Vivian's eyes widened in absolute shock. I placed the torn halves together and ripped them again and again until the $10,000 bribe was nothing but tiny, worthless shreds of paper. I opened my hand and let the pieces flutter to the beautiful Persian rug like dirty snow. I looked back up at my mother. Her mouth was hanging open, completely speechless. She had always controlled everyone around her with money and social pressure. She had absolutely no idea how to handle a woman who could not be bought. I did not say a single word to her. I simply turned my back on her and pushed the heavy mahogany doors open, stepping back out into the bright, chaotic light of the grand foyer. I walked straight past the confused security guards and headed directly toward the center of the massive living room. The party was at its absolute peak. Hundreds of wealthy guests were laughing, drinking, and toasting to my mother's fake success. I walked past Dr. Terry and Mr. Rollins, who were happily discussing the fake dividends Connor had promised them. Sydney was standing on the grand staircase holding a glass of champagne, looking down at the crowd like she was untouchable royalty. Connor was standing near the fireplace, sweating profusely through his expensive gray suit, constantly checking his phone and looking completely terrified of his own shadow. I ignored all of them. I walked straight up to the small wooden stage where the jazz quartet was playing a smooth, upbeat melody. The lead singer was a young woman in a velvet dress, softly crooning into a vintage silver microphone on a tall iron stand. I stepped onto the stage, reached out, and gently but firmly took the microphone straight out of her hands. The singer stumbled back in surprise, and the musicians stopped playing their instruments one by one. A loud, sharp screech of audio feedback echoed through the massive living room, instantly silencing the hundreds of guests. The room went dead quiet. Every single eye in the mansion turned to look at me, standing center stage in my stark white suit, with my heavy leather bag of federal evidence resting securely on my hip. I held the silver microphone firmly in my hand, letting the silence stretch out over the massive living room. The air was thick with tension. My mother had burst out of the library and was now standing frozen near the grand staircase, her hands covering her mouth. Sydney was glaring at me from the steps, her fake diamond necklace glittering under the chandeliers. Connor was standing near the fireplace, his face completely drained of color, staring at me like he was looking at a ghost. I did not look at any of them. I looked directly out into the crowd of wealthy guests at the people my mother had spent her entire life trying to impress. I tapped the microphone twice to make sure it was working. "Excuse the interruption," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the high ceilings. "My name is Morgan, and I am Vivian's youngest daughter. I know many of you have not seen me since my grandfather's funeral. My mother informed you that I was not here today because I was busy packing my apartment to move out of the city. That was a lie. I am actually here to deliver a very special presentation regarding the brilliant financial mastermind you have all been celebrating today." I reached into my white blazer and pulled out a small black remote control. I pointed it at the massive 8.2-inch flat-screen television mounted above the marble fireplace, right behind where Connor was standing. I pressed a button and the screen flashed to life. It instantly mirrored the display of the secure forensic tablet I had synced to the house network earlier. A loud collective gasp rippled through the crowd as the first slide appeared on the screen. It was not a photo of a new real estate development or a promising medical startup. It was a highly detailed forensic financial ledger. The logo for Connor's venture capital firm Apex Horizon Ventures was displayed prominently at the top. I looked down at Dr. Terry, who was standing in the front row. "Dr. Terry," I said softly, "3 weeks ago, you transferred $50,000 from your retirement pension into Apex Horizon Ventures. Connor told you it was going into a highly lucrative Silicon Valley tech incubator. He promised you a 20% return to help pay for your granddaughter's medical school tuition. Is that correct?" The old dentist looked confused, but he nodded slowly, his eyes darting between me and the massive screen. "Yes," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. "Connor said it was a guaranteed investment." I pressed the button on my remote. The screen changed, displaying a direct wire transfer receipt from Connor's corporate bank account. It showed the exact $50,000 Dr. Terry had deposited, but it did not go to Silicon Valley. The receipt showed that $10,000 of that exact deposit was immediately wired directly into Sydney's personal checking account. The remaining $40,000 was transferred to an offshore holding account in the Cayman Islands, registered under Connor's name. Murmurs of confusion and rising anger began to spread through the crowd. I did not stop. I pressed the button again, bringing up another document. "Mr. Rollins," I said, turning my attention to the retired surgeon standing near the bar. "You invested $200,000 last month. You were told it was funding a commercial real estate project in downtown Los Angeles. Instead, your money was used to pay off the fake dividend returns for Mrs. Robinson and 5 other investors in this very room to keep the illusion of profit alive. The rest of your life savings was used to lease the white Porsche currently parked in the driveway and to purchase the diamond necklace my sister is wearing right now." The murmurs erupted into loud, angry shouting. People were pointing at the screen, pointing at Sydney, and pointing at Connor. The flawless elite aesthetic of my mother's farewell party was completely destroyed in less than 3 minutes. I began rapidly clicking through the slides, displaying forged signature after forged signature, stolen deposit after stolen deposit. I laid out the entire Ponzi scheme with ruthless forensic precision. I showed them exactly how this white man had smiled in their faces, eaten dinner at their tables, and systematically drained the generational wealth of the Black community they had worked their entire lives to build. Connor was panicking. He stumbled forward, waving his hands wildly, trying to block the massive television screen behind him. "It is a lie," he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "She is a jealous psychopath. Those documents are completely fabricated. She hacked into my system and altered the numbers because she hates that I married her sister. Do not listen to her. I am making you all incredibly wealthy." But nobody was listening to his pathetic excuses. These were smart, educated people. They could read the official bank routing numbers and the digital notary stamps projected on the wall. They realized instantly that they had been completely conned by a smooth-talking fraud. Dr. Terry stepped forward, his face red with fury, and grabbed Connor roughly by the collar of his expensive gray suit. "Where is my money, you son of a bitch?" the elderly man yelled, shaking him violently. "Where is my granddaughter's tuition money?" Sydney ran down the stairs, screaming for people to back away from her husband, but the crowd was turning hostile, pushing against them, demanding answers. Vivian was backed against the wall, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the public humiliation. Her perfect world was collapsing right in front of her eyes. Connor shoved Dr. Terry away and scrambled backward, tripping over the edge of the expensive Persian rug. He looked like a cornered animal, completely stripped of his arrogant tech bro persona. He looked wildly around the room, trying to find a single friendly face, but saw only absolute rage. He locked eyes with me, standing calmly on the stage. His fear suddenly morphed into a violent, delusional defiance. "You cannot do this to me!" He screamed, his face purple with rage. "I am not some broke scam artist. I am a multimillionaire. I own the Malibu estate. I have the deed right here in my pocket. I am richer than all of you combined. Connor stood there panting like a cornered animal, clutching the breast pocket of his expensive suit where he kept his precious fake piece of paper. The sheer delusion of his statement hung in the heavy air for a few seconds. The angry crowd of investors paused momentarily, confused by his sudden burst of manic confidence. My mother, Vivian, looked up from her spot against the wall. Her tear-streaked face suddenly filled with a desperate, fragile hope. She wanted to believe him so badly. She wanted to believe that the Malibu beach house was real and that her golden son-in-law was going to magically save them all from this nightmare. Sydney even took a step down the grand staircase, her eyes darting between me and her husband, waiting for the ultimate proof that she was still a wealthy, elite socialite. I looked at Connor and I did not feel angry anymore. I felt a deep, profound sense of genuine amusement. I let out a low, steady laugh. The sound echoed through the silent living room, completely destroying the fragile tension Connor had just tried to build. My laughter was not manic or cruel. It was the genuine, relieved laughter of a woman watching a steel trap snap perfectly shut. Connor flinched at the sound of it. He pointed a shaking finger at me and demanded to know what was so funny. He yelled that he had the legal right to that property and that I was just a squatter. I stopped laughing and looked him dead in the eye. I told him his absolute ignorance was the funniest thing I had ever witnessed. I pointed the black remote control at the massive television screen one more time and pressed the button. The entire display shifted away from his fraudulent bank records and offshore Cayman Island accounts. A new set of documents appeared on the screen, glowing brightly in the dim light of the mansion. They were heavy, dense legal files covered in official state seals and federal watermarks. I told the crowd to pay very close attention to the screen because this was the final act of Connor's desperate little play. I walked to the very edge of the stage, keeping my voice calm and perfectly projected. I told Connor to go ahead and pull that precious deed out of his pocket. I told him to read the name of the property owner out loud to the entire room so everyone could hear his genius real estate strategy. Connor swallowed hard, his hand trembling violently as he reached into his jacket. He pulled out the crumpled quitclaim deed he had tried to force me to sign at the restaurant. He stammered and said the property was owned by the Elias Coastal Trust. I nodded slowly and told him he was absolutely right about that single detail. Grandpa Elias did build that magnificent glass house on the Malibu cliffs, but I told Connor he had completely misunderstood what that trust actually was. I clicked to the next slide showing the geographical survey of the massive Malibu property. I explained to the silent crowd that the land the house sat on was not zoned for luxury condo development. It was explicitly designated as a protected environmental sanctuary by the state of California. Grandpa Elias had purchased that specific stretch of coastline to protect the native wildlife and preserve the natural beauty of the oceanfront. To maintain that protected status, he placed the entire estate into a specialized corporate entity. It was a registered limited liability company designed specifically to manage federal conservation grants and strictly prohibit any commercial development. I looked down at Connor, who was now shaking so hard he could barely hold his fake piece of paper. I told him an individual person cannot simply inherit or take personal ownership of a federally recognized environmental LLC through a standard residential property deed. You cannot just forge a signature and claim a nature reserve as your personal venture capital asset to pay off your Ponzi scheme debts. The crowd murmured in realization as the massive legal reality set in. I clicked to the final slide on the television screen. It was the official articles of incorporation for the Elias Coastal Trust, filed directly with the state of California. My name was highlighted in bright yellow ink at the very bottom of the page. I told Connor to read the highlighted name. His voice was nothing but a dry, pathetic whisper as he read my name out loud to the quiet room. I smiled coldly and told him that I was the sole chief executive officer and the only registered shareholder of that environmental LLC. I told him I had complete, absolute corporate control over every single grain of sand on that Malibu beach. I did not just inherit a house from my grandfather. I inherited a federally protected corporation, and I was the only person on Earth with the legal authority to manage its assets. I took a step closer to the edge of the stage, looking down at him like a judge delivering a final devastating sentence. I told him that by forging property documents and attempting to transfer ownership of a protected corporate entity, he had crossed a massive legal line. I explained that when he emailed those fake documents to his offshore lender, he did not just commit standard residential forgery. He committed federal wire fraud and federal title fraud. He had attempted to steal protected land from a registered corporation across state lines. I told him those were not local county charges he could bribe his way out of. Those were massive federal felonies that carried mandatory minimum prison sentences. Connor dropped his fake deed onto the expensive Persian rug. The piece of paper fluttered to the ground, landing right next to the torn pieces of the $10,000 check my mother had tried to bribe me with. His legs gave out completely and he collapsed onto his knees in the middle of the living room. He buried his face in his hands, letting out a loud, pathetic sob. All of his arrogant tech bro posturing was instantly gone. He was just a broken criminal, sitting in a pile of his own lies. Sydney began to scream from the staircase, sobbing hysterically and demanding that someone do something to fix this. My mother Vivian just stared blankly at the wall, completely catatonic, as her entire high society world dissolved into dust. The wealthy guests began backing away from the family, creating a wide, empty circle around Connor's kneeling body. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with a man facing federal prison. I stood on the stage, feeling the heavy weight of the last 29 years completely lift off my shoulders. I had done exactly what Grandpa Elias had trained me to do. I had protected our legacy and destroyed the parasite trying to feed on our family. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by Sydney's pathetic wailing and Connor's quiet sobs. But then a new sound pierced through the heavy air of the mansion. It started as a faint, distant wail echoing up the winding roads of Baldwin Hills. Within seconds, the sound grew louder and more urgent, bouncing off the marble walls of the grand foyer. It was the sharp, undeniable wail of multiple police sirens. Flashing red and blue lights began to reflect through the massive front windows, illuminating the shocked faces of the party guests. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had officially arrived. The heavy wooden double doors of the Baldwin Hills mansion did not just open, they were violently forced apart. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark tactical jackets with the letters FBI printed across their backs swarmed into the grand marble foyer. The live jazz music had already stopped, but the sheer chaotic noise of the raid completely shattered whatever was left of my mother's elegant farewell party. Heavily armed agents moved swiftly through the crowd of terrified high society guests, shouting orders to stay back and keep their hands visible. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers parked in the driveway bathed the crystal chandeliers in a harsh, unforgiving glare. It was a scene of absolute destruction for the perfect image my family had spent decades trying to build and maintain. I stood perfectly still on the wooden stage, watching the federal agents fan out across the living room. They knew exactly who they were looking for. Special Agent Marcus Wright walked through the front doors, holding a thick file folder that looked exactly like the digital dossier I had emailed him just a few days ago. He scanned the crowd, his sharp eyes cutting through the panic, until he locked onto the pathetic figure kneeling on the expensive Persian rug. The moment Connor saw the federal jackets, his primal flight response completely hijacked his brain. He did not try to explain himself or call for his expensive strip mall lawyer. He scrambled up from the floor, his expensive gray suit wrinkled and stained with sweat. He shoved violently past Dr. Terry, knocking the elderly man into a cocktail table, sending crystal glasses shattering across the marble floor. Connor sprinted desperately toward the massive glass doors that led out to the backyard patio. He pushed through the terrified guests like a madman, his face twisted in absolute panic. He burst through the patio doors and hit the perfectly manicured back lawn, running blindly into the dark, toward the tall hedges that separated the estate from the golf course. But he did not make it very far. 3 federal agents had already secured the perimeter of the backyard. I watched through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows as a large agent stepped out from the shadows of a large oak tree. Connor tried to pivot, but his expensive Italian leather shoes slipped on the damp grass. The agent lunged forward, tackling him violently to the ground. Connor's face slammed hard into the dirt, completely ruining his perfect tech bro aesthetic. The agents yanked his arms firmly behind his back, and the cold metallic click of handcuffs echoed all the way into the living room. The self-proclaimed white savior of our black family was now eating dirt on the lawn, a federal prisoner caught in his own web of lies and greed. Sydney watched the entire tackle through the glass doors. Her perfect world, the designer clothes, the country club memberships, the endless supply of stolen cash had just been handcuffed and dragged away. She let out a blood-curdling scream that sounded like a wounded animal. She fell hard onto her knees right there in the middle of the living room, clutching her face as her heavy makeup ran down her cheeks in dark, thick streaks. She did not blame Connor for lying to her or stealing from her own community. In her twisted mind, there was only one person responsible for ruining her flawless life. She turned her tear-streaked face toward me, her eyes burning with pure venom. She screamed my name, telling me I was a monster. She crawled forward on the marble floor, her diamond tennis bracelet scraping against the stone. She yelled that I had planned this on purpose just to humiliate her in front of all her friends. She sobbed uncontrollably, claiming I was just a jealous, bitter spinster who could not stand to see her happy. She cried that her life was completely over, and that she would never be able to show her face in Los Angeles ever again. She blamed me for everything, completely ignoring the fact that her husband had funded her luxurious lifestyle with the stolen retirement pensions of the very people standing in the room. My mother Vivian was leaning heavily against the grand staircase, clutching her chest. She was hyperventilating, her breath coming in short, rapid gasps, as she watched the federal agents drag Connor back through the living room toward the front doors. The local politicians and wealthy doctors she had spent her life trying to impress were watching her with a mixture of pity and utter disgust. Her social standing was evaporating right before her eyes. The sheer embarrassment of having the FBI raid her home was too much for her fragile ego to process. But then her twisted narcissistic survival instinct finally kicked in. Vivian forced herself to stand up straight, smoothing down the front of her expensive silk gown. She took a deep breath and wiped the tears from her face, determined to salvage whatever was left of her precious pride. She raised her chin and looked around the room at the angry investors, specifically making eye contact with Dr. Terry and Mr. Rollins. "Fine," she yelled, her voice shaking but laced with arrogant defiance. "Take him away. We do not need him. We never needed him. I had absolutely no idea he was doing these horrible things to my friends. My family is a victim here too." Vivian stepped away from the staircase, walking toward the center of the room, trying to reclaim her position as the powerful matriarch. She waved her hand dismissively toward the front doors where Connor had just been escorted out. She told the crowd not to worry about their stolen money. She promised she would make everything right because the family name was more important than anything else. She puffed out her chest and declared that she would personally fix the mess that Connor had created. "I will sell this Baldwin Hills house today," Vivian announced, her voice ringing with desperate authority. "The market value is over $8 million. I will list it tomorrow morning, and I will use the proceeds from my house to pay every single one of you back. You have my absolute word." The room went quiet again as the guests absorbed her promise. My mother looked at me standing on the stage, a smug, triumphant expression creeping back onto her face. She really thought she had just saved the day. She thought she had outsmarted me and preserved her elite reputation by sacrificing the one thing she loved most in the world. I did not move. I just looked down at her with pure, absolute ice in my eyes. The final piece of the trap was ready to drop. I lowered the microphone slightly and let a cold smile touch my lips. "Selling whose house, Mom?" I asked quietly. The entire room fell into a dead, suffocating silence the moment those words left my mouth. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers outside continued to sweep across the walls, casting long, harsh shadows over the faces of the wealthy guests. My mother blinked rapidly, her face twisting into a mask of pure, absolute confusion. She stared at me as if I had just started speaking an entirely different language. She dropped her hands from her chest and took a step toward the stage, her silk gown rustling loudly in the quiet room. She asked me what on earth I was talking about. She puffed out her chest, attempting to summon the last remaining shreds of her elite matriarch persona. She loudly declared to the crowd that this was her house and her historic family estate. She insisted that the family lawyer had read Grandpa's last will and testament just 2 days after the funeral, and that the deed to the Baldwin Hills mansion was explicitly left to her as his sole surviving daughter. She practically screamed that she had the official legal paperwork sitting in her home office desk to prove it, and that I was completely out of my mind. I stepped down from the small wooden stage, my low heels clicking softly against the marble floor. I kept my eyes locked entirely on her, watching the desperate panic bubbling just beneath her arrogant surface. I told her that the family lawyer read a standard boilerplate will that Grandpa Elias had drafted over 15 years ago. I explained to her that a last will and testament can only legally distribute the assets that a deceased person actually possesses at the exact time of their death. I told her that she needed to pay very close attention to the timeline of Grandpa's financial decisions because her entire reality was about to shatter. I walked slowly past the crowd of shocked investors and local politicians. The guests parted for me like the Red Sea, completely captivated by the absolute public dismantling of my mother's fake empire. Dr. Terry and Mr. Rollins watched me with wide eyes, realizing that the family they had trusted with their life savings was nothing but a hollow shell. I walked directly toward the grand marble fireplace at the far end of the massive living room. Hanging directly above the mantel was a huge custom oil portrait of Grandpa Elias. He was painted, wearing his simple gray work suit, his rough, calloused hands resting on a wooden cane, and his dark eyes looking sharp and uncompromising. It was the only piece of true authenticity in this entire mansion, filled with flashy imported garbage and fake designer luxury. Vivian followed me across the room, her expensive dress dragging awkwardly across the Persian rugs. She demanded to know what I was doing near his portrait. She yelled at me to step away from the fireplace, telling me I had already ruined her farewell party and humiliated the family name enough for one night. She told me to leave her house immediately before she called the federal agents back inside to arrest me for trespassing. I completely ignored her desperate screaming. I reached up and grabbed the heavy ornate gold frame of the oil painting. I pulled hard on the left side of the heavy wood. The entire massive portrait swung forward smoothly on a set of deeply concealed industrial hinges. A loud collective gasp echoed through the crowded living room. Hidden perfectly behind the painting set, completely flush into the solid stone of the chimney, was a sleek matte black biometric wall safe. My mother stopped dead in her tracks, her mouth hanging wide open in utter disbelief. She had lived in this Baldwin Hills mansion for over 2 decades. She had hosted hundreds of elite high society dinner parties standing right in front of this very fireplace, drinking imported champagne and bragging to her friends. She had absolutely no idea this hidden vault even existed in her own home. She stared at the glowing blue biometric scanner on the front of the heavy steel door, looking completely betrayed by the very walls around her. Sydney, who was still kneeling on the floor crying over Connor's arrest, stopped sobbing and stared at the hidden safe with wide, terrified eyes. I placed my thumb against the cool glass of the biometric scanner. The machine beeped softly, confirming my identity. Then a small digital keypad illuminated in the dark recess of the stone wall. I slowly typed in a 6-digit PIN code. It was the exact date of the day Grandpa Elias first taught me how to read a corporate financial ledger when I was just a young girl. The heavy steel bolts inside the door retracted with a loud, heavy mechanical clank that echoed perfectly in the silent room. I pulled the thick steel door open. Sitting alone on the dark metal shelf inside the vault was a thick, aged manila envelope. It was sealed with dark red wax and stamped with official county markers. I pulled it out and closed the heavy safe door behind me, pushing the large oil portrait back into its original position until it clicked shut. The stern, painted eyes of my grandfather looked down at the room as if he was watching his final master plan unfold flawlessly from beyond the grave. I turned around and walked back toward the center of the room, approaching a massive slab of imported marble that served as a display counter for my mother's expensive crystal vases. I stopped right in front of the marble surface, holding the heavy sealed envelope in my hands. I looked at my mother, who was now visibly trembling, shaking her head in silent denial. I told her that Grandpa Elias was the smartest man I had ever known. I said he saw right through Connor's pathetic tech bro disguise the very first time Sydney brought that white man to our Thanksgiving dinner 5 years ago. Grandpa knew instantly that Connor was a financial parasite looking for a wealthy black family to infiltrate and drain. But more importantly, I told Vivian that Grandpa also knew exactly who she was. He knew her bottomless vanity and her desperate need to impress the local elite would eventually make her the perfect blind victim for a scam artist like Connor. Grandpa knew with absolute certainty that if he actually left this historic estate to her in his will, she would inevitably hand it right over to Connor the moment he batted his eyes and promised her a slightly larger house on the coast. I broke the red wax seal on the manila envelope and pulled out a stack of thick legal documents. I told the silent room that Grandpa Elias refused to let his lifelong legacy be destroyed by a fake venture capitalist, and a daughter who cared more about country club status than her own flesh and blood. So he took extreme legal measures to protect the physical foundation of this family. He secretly executed an irrevocable transfer of title long before he ever got sick. I told my mother that the fraudulent $2 million mortgage Connor took out on this property last night was completely null and void. I explained that the offshore criminals in the Cayman Islands could not legally seize this mansion because Connor had forged the signature of a woman who did not even hold a single penny of equity in the property. My mother had unknowingly shielded the house from foreclosure simply by being entirely legally irrelevant. Vivian's face went completely blank as the devastating reality of my words finally started to crush her completely. She shook her head slowly, whispering over and over again that it was impossible and that she was the owner of the estate. I raised the heavy stack of documents high in the air so everyone in the room could see the official state seals and the bold black signatures of the federal judges. I brought my hand down hard. I slapped the deed onto the marble counter. Grandpa did not leave this house to you, Mom. He transferred it to my firm 5 years ago. My mother stared at the thick stack of papers on the marble counter as if they were covered in poison. Her hands were shaking so violently that when she finally reached out to pick up the top document, the paper rattled loudly in the silent room. She read the bold black text at the top of the page. She read the name of my corporate firm, and she read the date of the transfer. It was signed and notarized exactly 5 years ago, while Grandpa Elias was still alive and perfectly healthy. Vivian dropped the paper back onto the marble, her legs giving out slightly as she slumped against the edge of the counter. Sydney slowly stood up from the floor where she had been kneeling. Her expensive designer dress was ruined, and her makeup was a disaster. She walked over to the counter like a zombie and looked at the deed. The realization hit her even harder than the FBI raid had. She looked down at the massive diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist and the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. I watched her eyes widen in absolute horror as the math finally clicked in her head. I told her those diamonds were not a gift from a wealthy Silicon Valley genius. They were purchased directly with Dr. Terry Pension Fund and Mr. Rollins' life savings. I told her the federal government was going to seize every single piece of jewelry, every designer handbag, and every luxury car sitting in that driveway to pay back the victims of her husband's Ponzi scheme. She was going to be left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back. I looked at both of them standing there completely stripped of everything they thought made them superior. I told them their entire lives were a complete illusion. The offshore bank accounts were frozen. The venture capital firm was a crime scene, and the money was entirely gone. All of their elite high society friends were currently backing toward the front doors, whispering in deep disgust as they watched the mighty fall. My mother looked around the room, seeing the pure judgment in the eyes of the people she had worshipped her entire life. She realized she was not the queen of Baldwin Hills anymore. She was just the mother-in-law of a federal criminal and a woman who had been living a massive lie. I leaned against the marble counter and crossed my arms, looking around the grand foyer. I told them that for the last 5 years they had been parading around this historic estate, treating me like an unwanted guest in my own home. My mother had constantly reminded me that I was just taking up valuable space and that I should be endlessly grateful she even allowed me to sleep in my old childhood bedroom. I reminded her of the cruel things she said to me right after Grandpa's funeral when she and Connor violently kicked me out into the street so he could have a new office for his fake startup. I let out a dry laugh that held absolutely no warmth. I told Vivian the absolute peak of the irony was that she had been illegally squatting on my corporate property this entire time. I explained that when Grandpa Elias transferred the title, he specifically structured it so that my firm would assume all maintenance costs and property taxes silently through a blind ledger. He did that so Vivian would never see the bills and never suspect a single thing until the time was exactly right. But legally speaking, my mother and sister were just unauthorized tenants living in a commercial investment property without a signed lease agreement. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and opened the calculator app. The bright screen illuminated my face in the dim lighting of the foyer. I told them I was a senior forensic accountant and that I always kept very meticulous records. I started typing in the numbers, speaking them out loud, so the entire room could hear the exact price of their arrogant entitlement. I told them the fair market rental value for a fully furnished historic 8-bedroom mansion in the premier neighborhood of Baldwin Hills was roughly $30,000 a month. I multiplied $30,000 by 12 months to get the annual rate. Then I multiplied that sum by the 5 entire years they had lived there since the title transfer was finalized. My mother watched my fingers move across the bright screen, her breathing becoming incredibly erratic and shallow. I hit the equal sign and looked up from the phone, locking my eyes directly onto hers. I told Vivian she currently owed my firm exactly $1,800,000 in unpaid back rent. I added that this massive figure did not even include the standard late fees or the extensive property damage caused by Connor's completely illegal structural renovations to my house. The sheer magnitude of the number hit Vivian like a physical blow to the chest. $1.8 million in debt to the very daughter she had just publicly disowned at a luxury restaurant days prior. She literally gasped for air, grabbing the edge of the marble counter to keep herself from completely collapsing onto the hard floor. All of the vicious pride, the nasty superiority, and the elite condescension she had worn like armor her entire life completely vanished. She was not a powerful socialite matriarch anymore. She was a terrified, broke woman facing a massive legal judgment she could never possibly pay. Vivian stumbled forward, closing the distance between us. Her hands reached out, trembling violently as she tried to grab my arms. I took a quick step back, refusing to let her touch me or infect my peace. The tears streaming down her face now were not the fake theatrical tears she had used to manipulate the crowd earlier. These were tears of pure, absolute, unfiltered desperation. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, begging me to stop the nightmare. She cried out my name, her voice cracking into a pathetic wail that echoed off the high ceilings. She begged me not to do this to her. She said she was a foolish old woman who had been completely brainwashed by Connor and his charming lies. She sobbed that she did not know what she was doing and that she never meant to hurt me or push me away. She fell hard to her knees right in front of me, the expensive silk of her custom gown pooling around her on the cold marble floor. She looked up at me, her face completely wrecked with fear, and begged for mercy. "Please, Morgan," she cried, her voice breaking into a desperate sob. "Please do not throw us out into the street. You cannot do this to me. I am your mother. Please forgive me. But we are family." I looked down at the woman kneeling on the marble floor, holding the crumpled silk of her designer gown. The word family hung in the heavy air between us, sounding entirely hollow and completely offensive. She was weaponizing the very concept she had spent my entire life destroying. I did not reach out to help her up. I did not offer her a tissue to dry her desperate tears. I just stood there looking at her with a calm, steady clarity that I had never felt before in my entire life. I told her not to dare use that word with me. My voice was quiet, but it carried through the grand foyer, cutting through the wailing sirens outside. I asked her what she actually thought family meant. I told her family does not kick their own daughter out of her childhood home just because a lying tech bro wants a new office for a fake startup. Family does not sit at a luxury restaurant watching a man threaten to call the police on me and then stand up to publicly disown me just to protect their fragile social status. I pointed at Sydney, who was still sitting on the floor, shivering in her stolen diamonds. I said family does not laugh when their sister is treated like a piece of garbage. Vivian let out a choked sob, pressing her hands against her face. She tried to formulate an excuse, but I did not let her speak. I told her she did not know the first thing about family. She only knew about aesthetics and optics. She only cared about how things looked to the wealthy politicians and doctors standing in this room. I told her that Grandpa Elias was the only person in this house who actually understood what family meant. He knew that true family protects each other from predators. He spent 10 years secretly building that beautiful glass house in Malibu to give me a safe haven because he knew the day would come when my own mother would throw me to the wolves just to keep her country club membership. My mother reached out again, her manicured fingers brushing the hem of my white trousers. She begged me to give her another chance. She said she would change and that we could go back to the way things were. She promised she would cut ties with Connor and that we could run this estate together, just the three of us. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, breaking the physical contact completely. I told her there was absolutely no going back because the illusion was entirely dead. I told her I did not want her apologies, and I absolutely refused to forgive her. Forgiveness is a gift you give to people who actually show genuine remorse, not to people who are only crying because they finally got caught. I told her she was not sorry for how she treated me. She was only sorry that she did not own the $8 million mansion she had been bragging about all week. I reached into my heavy leather tote bag one last time. I pulled out a crisp white legal envelope that I had prepared alongside the forensic files. I dropped it onto the marble counter right next to the massive stack of title transfer documents. The paper landed with a soft thud. Vivian stared at it, her eyes wide with fresh terror. She asked me what it was, her voice barely a whisper. I told her it was a formal, legally binding eviction notice, drafted and signed by the corporate attorneys representing my firm. I told her she and Sydney had exactly 48 hours to pack their personal belongings and vacate the premises completely. I clarified that personal belongings did not include the expensive artwork, the custom furniture, or the imported chandeliers, because Grandpa Elias had purchased all of those assets and transferred them to the trust as well. They could only take their clothes, their shoes, and whatever fake pride they had left. Sydney finally found her voice screaming from the floor that I could not do this to them and that they had nowhere to go. She cried that Connor's bank accounts were frozen and they did not have a single dollar to rent an apartment. I looked at my older sister and felt absolutely no pity. I told her that was a problem she should have considered before she let her husband steal the life savings of elderly black folks to buy her tennis bracelets. I told them that when the 48 hours expired, the locks would be electronically changed and any property left inside would be liquidated to help pay off the $1.8 million debt they still owed my company. The sheer brutality of the boundary I had just drawn left them entirely speechless. Vivian slumped forward, resting her forehead against the cold marble floor, completely broken. There was no more fighting left in her. The facade was entirely gone, and the reality of her new impoverished life had finally crushed her. I looked up from my broken family and turned my attention back to the wealthy guests who were still standing near the edges of the room. Dr. Terry and Mr. Rollins were looking at Vivian with pure, unadulterated disgust. They had just watched this woman try to bribe her way out of trouble and then beg for mercy using the same family card she had completely disregarded when it suited her. They realized that Vivian would have gladly let them lose their entire retirement funds if it meant she got to keep her big house and her wealthy status. Dr. Terry shook his head, his face set in a hard grimace. He turned his back on my mother and walked silently toward the front doors. Mr. Rollins followed him. One by one, the local politicians, the socialites, and the wealthy real estate developers turned their backs on Vivian and Sydney. They walked out of the mansion in absolute silence, leaving their half-empty champagne glasses on the silver trays. The grand farewell party was officially over. My mother had wanted to host the social event of the season, and she certainly had. No one in Los Angeles would ever forget the night Vivian's fake empire burned to the ground. I picked up my leather tote bag and secured it over my shoulder. I did not say goodbye. I did not look back at the two women sobbing on the floor of the grand foyer. I simply turned around and walked toward the heavy wooden double doors. My low heels clicked rhythmically against the marble, echoing loudly through the massive spaces of the empty house. The air felt incredibly light as I stepped over the threshold and walked out into the cool night air. The federal agents were still outside processing Connor's arrest near the police cruisers, but I walked right past them. I left my mother and sister alone in the massive, echoing mansion they no longer owned, surrounded by the ghosts of their own greed and the absolute certainty that they had brought this entirely upon themselves. 6 months have passed since that night at the Baldwin Hills mansion. The air this morning is cool and salty as I sit on the expansive wooden deck of the Malibu beach house, holding a warm, ceramic mug of tea. The massive panels of reinforced glass behind me reflect the bright early sunlight, but my eyes are focused entirely on the endless stretch of the Pacific Ocean. The rhythmic sound of the waves crashing against the rocky cliffs below is the only sound I hear. There are no jazz bands, no clinking champagne glasses, and absolutely no toxic family members telling me I am taking up too much space. For the first time in my 29 years of life, the space I occupy is entirely my own. The fallout from the farewell party was incredibly swift and absolutely devastating for the people who thought they could build an empire on lies. Special Agent Marcus Wright did not waste any time building his case against Connor. The digital dossier I provided was so airtight that Connor's expensive defense attorneys advised him not to even attempt taking it to trial. A federal judge sentenced him to 15 years in a high-security federal penitentiary for wire fraud, title fraud, and running a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. He tried to use his charm and his supposed Silicon Valley pedigree to beg for a lighter sentence, but the judge was completely unmoved. All of his offshore accounts were seized and frozen. The Cayman Islands holdings were repatriated, and the funds were systematically distributed back to Dr. Terry, Mr. Rollins, and the rest of the elderly investors he had targeted. The white savior of our family is now wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, mopping cafeteria floors for 40 cents an hour. My sister Sydney learned a very harsh lesson about what happens when your entire identity is tied to the wealth of a fraudulent man. When the federal authorities seized Connor's assets, they took absolutely everything she claimed to own. The Porsche, the designer wardrobes, the silk gowns, and the diamond tennis bracelets were all confiscated and auctioned off by the government to pay criminal restitution. She was left with nothing but a few cheap suitcases of casual clothes. Today, the former beauty queen of the Baldwin Hills elite works a minimum wage retail job at a mid-tier department store in the valley. She spends her days folding sweaters and ringing up purchases for the exact same wealthy socialites she used to look down on. I heard through the grapevine that she actively hides in the stockroom whenever she sees someone from our old neighborhood walking through the glass doors. Her perfect aesthetic was completely shattered, and she is finally being forced to live in the real world. As for my mother, Vivian, her grand dynasty collapsed exactly the way it was always destined to. When the 48-hour eviction notice expired, my corporate attorneys arrived at the mansion with local law enforcement to ensure she vacated the premises. She tried to stall, and she tried to beg the officers for mercy. But the law is the law. She could not pay the $1.8 million in back rent. She owed my firm, so she was forced to declare bankruptcy. Her credit was completely destroyed, and her reputation was entirely incinerated. All of her wealthy friends, the politicians, and the country club elite completely blacklisted her. She now lives in a tiny, cramped, one-bedroom apartment on the far eastern outskirts of the city. She has no garden, no grand marble staircase, and no audience to perform for. She is entirely alone with nothing but the crushing memory of the daughter she threw away for a fake sense of superiority. I did not keep the Baldwin Hills mansion. Walking through those empty halls after they left only reminded me of the emotional coldness I endured there as a child. So I put the historic estate on the market and sold it to a legitimate real estate developer for $8.5 million. But I did not put that money into a personal bank account. I wanted to honor the true legacy of Grandpa Elias, the man who actually built our family name through hard work and genuine community care. I took the entire proceeds from the sale and founded the Elias Business Incubator in downtown Los Angeles. It is a fully funded foundation dedicated exclusively to providing startup capital, legal resources, and mentorship for young Black entrepreneurs who do not have generational wealth or supportive families to fall back on. We are building real sustainable businesses, not fake venture capital Ponzi schemes. Grandpa Elias would have been incredibly proud to see his wealth being used to actually elevate our community, instead of being used to buy fake diamonds and luxury cars. I take a slow sip of my tea and let the warm ocean breeze wash over my face. Cutting ties with my mother and my sister was the hardest and most painful decision I ever had to make, but it was also the most necessary. Society constantly tells us that we have to forgive and forget because blood is thicker than water. They tell us that we must endure abuse, manipulation, and theft simply because the people hurting us happen to share our last name. But I learned the hard way that true family is defined by mutual respect, protection, and genuine love. If the people who share your DNA are actively trying to destroy you, it is not a betrayal to walk away. It is an act of fundamental self-preservation. Sometimes the trash takes itself out, and sometimes you have to hire a corporate attorney to drag it to the curb. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that made you sick, and you certainly cannot build a peaceful life while actively housing the people who want to see you fail. My name is Morgan, and I am finally completely free. Have you ever had to legally protect yourself from your own family? Let me know in the comments. Like and subscribe for more stories.